right, welcome everybody to Maria and tonight's presentation from Keith Warner in the Port of Seattle. Maria is the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit dedicated to education on renewable energy and sustainable living. Besides tonight's presentation, we have some pretty interesting subjects coming up. We've got in February, Bartlett tree experts. Bartlett is one of the world's leading scientific tree care companies, and they will be talking about best practices on growing healthy trees and the use of biochar. And then in March, the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center and Jack's Solar Garden will be presenting on the topic of solar farms coexisting with agriculture. Very interesting. A lot of times, you either have a farm of solar panels and nothing growing underneath of them, or you have farm fields. Well, these folks and some others have combined the two where you can actually grow crops underneath solar panels. And then in April, we have Adragon Aeroponics. We'll learn about vertical farming to grow crops to provide fresh produce to local communities. And we'll also learn how vertical farming can work on a small scale as well as a large scale. And then beyond that, May, June, we're probably going to have some kind of presentation, not firmed up yet, from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Could be a topic on advances in solar materials. And the other would be on integrating solar and wind into the grid. It's going to be a major problem as more electric vehicles go online and more renewable energy goes online. So with that, I'll turn it over to Phil, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you. Some of the most polluting industries in the world are aviation and maritime. In our global society, with our desire to travel and to acquire from everywhere, we are dependent on powerful and hungry ships and airplanes. Taming their fossil fuel demand is a daunting task. Thankfully, the Port of Seattle is becoming a beacon to help draw us away from fossil fuels through local efforts and international partnerships to clean up and electrify our country's major airports and seaports. Keith Warner is here tonight to share the programs, initiatives, partnerships at the Port of Seattle has undertaken to help with airports and seaports on a greener path to our future. Keith Warner is the utilities manager of the Port of Seattle, where he leads a suite of utility services, including power, water, and natural gas, serving Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Seattle-Tacoma is the 8th busiest airport in the U.S. and counts as part of its vision to be the greenest and most energy-efficient port in North America. Prior to joining the port in 2019, Keith enjoyed a 35-year career at the Boeing Company, where he spent the majority of that time as the corporation's utilities and conservation manager. Keith holds a BS in engineering and an executive MBA. We're very pleased to have you tonight, Keith. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to join you all. I'm just doing an audio and visual check. Is the screen coming through fine?
Keith, you need to do the right click and hide presenter view. There you go.
Thank you. That should take care of it. Well, I'm really pleased to join you all actually it turned out to be a sunny day here in Seattle. So the sun's just about to set here on West Coast time. So let me get right into it and talk a little bit about presentation this evening. So you can see on the left-hand side sort of my rough outline of the agenda. I'll give you a little overview on exactly what the Port of Seattle is, who we are, and what we do. I think there's interest in our energy and environmental targets that drive a lot of our efforts here at the Port of Seattle. I'll dive a little deeper talking about the energy portfolio and the strategy that we have within that. Lots of interest now in transportation electrification. So lots of different types of vehicles, both on land and in the air, that we'll talk about, and I guess the sea as well. One of the big challenges we have, particularly at the airport where I operate, is we have a large central mechanical plant that feeds our whole terminal. And we have some big decisions to make on what that looks like in the future as we try to reduce our carbon footprint. Talk a little bit about the maritime side as well. That's a part of the Port of Seattle. And then just a few other random things that we're working on in the sustainability field. And maybe I'll just start with this photo that you see on the right. That's an aerial view of downtown Seattle, which is in the lower left corner, right below our Port of Seattle insignia. So that's the downtown area, and you can see the waterfront there on Puget Sound. So our maritime division has a lot of properties along there that serve a variety of infrastructure needs. You see Mount Rainier there in the far distance. The body of water to the left of downtown Seattle.
Jim, Phil Jones calling back.
And actually that's Lake Washington. So Puget Sound is saltwater, ocean going. That's a lake. That strip along there is Interstate 90. So Interstate 90 starts in Seattle and ends in Chicago. And just a point in the intro, it noted that I used to work at Boeing. At the very end of this lake, if you can see my pointer, that's the Boeing 737 plant where all Boeing 737s have been and continue to be built at a rate of about 2 airplanes every day. So Port of Seattle Maritime, and then this little patch of light colored ground out here, that's the international airport that serves the Puget Sound area. So the Port of Seattle is actually a governmental agency, and it's our mission really to work on promoting economic opportunities, not just in and around Seattle, but really within the state and the Northwest. And we're doing that through really working to advance trade, travel, and commerce, as well as job creation, and doing all of that with equity in mind, being accountable to our constituents, and notably for tonight's conversation, in an environmentally responsible manner. So that's really the nexus of the Port of Seattle, which is governed by an elected board of commissioners, and that's how we operate in our governance structure. We're really formed out of 2 different divisions, a maritime and an aviation. So we started as a maritime group back here about 110 years ago. The Seattle Waterfront needed some organization, and the founding fathers of the city looked to form a new governmental agency known now as the Port of Seattle to handle all of the activity that was going on at the Seaport. Now, probably compared to Pennsylvania, you know, the state of Washington was only a state 20 years at that point. Formed in 1887, as I recall. So still a little bit of the Wild West, but over the last century, the Port of Seattle has built a lot of infrastructure to support a lot of commerce, cargo terminals, cruise ships, grain terminals, fishing fleets, mortgage and recreational boating. You can see some of those examples in that lower left photo. You see a large cargo ship coming into the harbor. It's going to go down to one of our facilities, offload all of those shipping containers, reloaded with new products headed to other parts of the world. It's kind of hard to see, but right in the center, there is a very small, it looks very small, but that's a large cruise ship that docks in the summertime. We do a lot of cruise ships up to Alaska. And you also see in the waters, maybe some fishing vessels, and I see several recreational sailboats. And we have facilities that support all that on the maritime side. When we jump to aviation, right after World War II, there was a need to have a governmental agency build a new commercial airport. So what was in some vacant land halfway between Seattle and Tacoma, the airport was formed, and we built our first terminal pretty much where the existing one is. You can see from this aerial view, it's that sort of X-shaped facility there. Started in 1949. And in the ensuing 70 years, we've grown to be the 8th busiest airport in the United States in 2019, so sort of pre-COVID. That year, we served over 50 million passengers, and we were really busting at the seams. That's about a 50% growth in just the last 10 years in terms of passenger numbers. And so we've been the last 5 years doing a lot of capital investment to increase our capacity at the airport, to be able to serve the needs now and well into the future. This is a shot, an aerial view looking west now. So those mountains in the distance are the Olympic Mountains, and that again is Puget Sound, which is the water. think I'll also note now this, as you can see, we're pretty much landlocked. So we have a lot of constraints to really grow the airport, which makes some of our decisions even more challenging. Let me start and shift towards our goals and targets. And at the highest level, at the port level, we have a very specific goal to be the greenest and most energy port in all of North America. So that's really sort of the guiding mission for myself and a lot of folks in our sustainability world here at the Port of Seattle. And while there are a series of measures and targets, I'll focus on the two that are probably most germane to the conversation tonight around energy and greenhouse gases. The first measure that we have is that we need to meet all increased energy needs through conservation and or renewables. So we've had some success in that, particularly through a lot of the conservation efforts that we've done over the last couple of decades, a lot of traditional conservations such that we use less power today than we did a decade ago, even though we have a lot of increased use and demand from the larger number of passengers and a lot more electrification. And then the other way we measure it is with our greenhouse gas or GHG emissions. And we use the categorization of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And if you're not familiar with what those are, they are measures of greenhouse gases from different attributes. So scope 1 are emissions that are directly related to our port operations. Think of this predominantly as things coming out of tailpipes of port vehicles or maybe out of the smokestacks from our central boiler operations where we're burning natural gas to heat in the wintertime. So that's what our scope 1 emissions are. Scope 2 are the emissions associated with the electrical power that we use. So there may be power plants far and wide. They're all feeding the power into us at the Port of Seattle. And this is a way to measure the greenhouse gas emissions of those. So for the Port of Seattle, we combine our scope 1 and scope 2 together. And we have both near-term and long-term targets. And you can see both a current and a proposed columns there. I'll note that it's our goal to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 from a 2005 baseline. And our original intent was to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, our elected commissioners just ramped that up. That proposed column has actually been adopted by our commissioners just in the last 2 months. So it's become more aggressive, particularly on the out years. So our 2030 targets remain the same to be 50%, but now we've ratcheted up the 2050 time frame now to a 2040 time frame and worded it a little bit different where we're now net zero or better. And then the last category that we actually do a lot of work on that might put us in a little different field than a lot of other entities, which is the scope 3 emissions. And so these are really things that we can try and influence, but they're really the emissions of others. So it might be the airlines themselves and how they're operating here. It's some of our tenants. It's even, we measure the transportation impact of people driving to and from the airport. And we have very specific goals, as you can see, both proposed and the current. And again, the proposed are now in effect. So looking to do that same 50% by 2030 and to be carbon neutral or better by 2050, which is a more aggressive target than the 80% noted in 2050. And so the last image here on the slide is really the look ahead on how we're going to achieve some of these major milestones. So this is a measure of our greenhouse gas emissions at the Port of Seattle. On the left-hand column, you can see we're measuring those in metric tons. Our 2005 baseline was 25,000 tons, kind of that top bar. Where we're at today in 2021, we've dropped fairly significantly. You can see in the box there, there's two things, RNG and RD. RNG is renewable natural gas. I'll talk about that more. We've also started using renewable diesel in some of our large vehicles. And so those two combined in particularly 2021, have done a significant reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. You'll also note here by the two colors that it's got both the aviation and the maritime emissions. And aviation really does dominate. We just have much larger facilities and more energy intensive operations than the facilities on our maritime side for our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. We have some pretty aggressive fleet electrification goals. So I just adopted a 2030 plan to convert all of our light duty vehicles, and we have a fleet of about 750 vehicles at the port, convert those all over to all electric. That will help reduce our emissions. And as I noted earlier, and I'll talk more, we have a big challenge with our central plant. A lot of those emissions are coming from natural gas used for heating. And along the bottom, you can see that there was a star out in 2050. That was our original goal to be to be net zero. That has moved a decade earlier. That's now the red star. So we've got to be a little more aggressive in our planning to be net zero by 2040. So that's really a look at the future. Let me take one chart and talk a little bit about our journey so far. So again, measuring metric tons for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from both maritime and aviation. And this way, in this view, you can see the breakout from natural gas, electricity, and what we're calling liquid fuels, which predominantly are gasoline and diesel for our vehicles. Our baseline year of 2005 was at 25,000. We've made some steady progress over the years. I have an arrow there in what would be 2021. We've not officially released our numbers, but with the introduction of a big renewable natural gas component for our natural gas heating boilers and conversion of our bus fleet, we have actually reduced our emissions by that 50% nearly a decade early, which is the target on the right-hand side. And again, you also see the biggest component is that natural gas, and that's predominantly at the airport, and it's for heating purposes. Our electricity component has been fairly clean over the years, continues to get a little bit cleaner and will continue. And as noted, we are making progress on our liquid fuels by converting to our renewable diesel right now and working on the fleet electrification plan. So let me jump one more level down and talk specifically about our power portfolio. And while I'll get to the pretty picture on the right side of your screen, let me first talk the chart on the left, which is a chart comparing energy sources. First, on the national level, as you might expect, it's a pretty mature mix of natural gas and coal and nuclear and some wind, and only about 7% is hydro within the United States. Now, as you head out west, particularly that middle column of the Pacific Northwest, the hydro component jumps to over 50%. We still use natural gas for heat, for peaking demand. We do have a few coal plants left, particularly in Montana, Wyoming, but they are generally being phased out. So coal, by and large, is going to be going away in the Northwest. We do have a significant wind and emerging solar opportunity that continues to grow, but hydropower still is pretty king out here in the Northwest. And then the far left column is the Bonneville Power Administration. And that's a federal agency, if you're not familiar with them, that markets all of the power generated by the federally owned dams on all the Northwest rivers. There's 31 dams that produce a large quantity of hydroelectric power, and BPA, which is the part of the Energy Department, is the entity that markets all of that power to some 140 utilities in the region. They also own and operate 3/4 of the transmission grid in the region. So they're a very big player. And we at the Port of Seattle, because we are a public agency and we actually operate our own electric utility, we have rights to that power portfolio. So even though I'm in the Northwest, I have rights to that BPA piece. And so our power portfolio has been and will continue to be roughly 95% carbon-free through both the hydropower and the nuclear that's in place. That other category is just some of the balancing power that's used throughout the year, and it averages less than 5%. So we've got a very green power supply portfolio. That's great for us. It really helps with our electrification plans. Let me jump to the image on the right, which is one of those 31 dams that I talked about, and actually the biggest. This is Grand Coulee Dam in central Washington State. Compared to the earlier pictures of water and trees, this is the arid side of Washington State. You can tell by the landscape. This is the Columbia River that starts in Canada and comes through Washington and then separates Washington and Oregon before going to the Pacific. So this facility generates about 6,000 megawatts at peak demand, and really has been in place since went into operation in 1942. And so it continues to pump out lots of power, and it's marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration. And as you can kind of tell from the landscape of what's Eastern Washington, lots of power generation, pretty sparse population. And so a lot of that power moves from east to west to fuel a lot of the demand, which is on the western side of the state. So that's the power portfolio. Next, let me just talk about, normally I'd talk about natural gas, but really normally there's nothing unique about natural gas. You know, it's in the ground for us in the Northwest. The supplies come from British Columbia to the north and from Wyoming to the Southwest. And so there are interstate pipelines that bring that fuel into the Washington State area. And so we've used that gas for many years, but what's something unique that we've done, last year we signed a 10-year contract for what's known as renewable natural gas. And if you're not familiar with that, it's really natural gas that's sourced from either landfills, typically waste treatment plants, or also from dairy farms. So our contract that goes for the next 10 years, we're sourcing gas from a landfill operation. And then the way that we do our carbon accounting, that's considered renewable. And so it's essentially a zero carbon. And so we really have two applications where we use that renewable natural gas. First, we have a fleet of buses that you can see in the upper right-hand photo. We use those buses to shuttle the thousands of employees every day from the remote parking lots into our terminal for their days of work. We also use the bus fleet to shuttle passengers from the airport to the offsite facility for the rental car facility. So all of those buses we have are using 100% renewable natural gas. Prior to this contract, we were burning compressed natural gas, so it was a fairly easy switch from an infrastructure standpoint. We've been running gas buses for, I think, the previous 5 to 8 years. So our bus fleet now is 100% renewable and will be at least for the next 10 years. The other thing that, and that's using renewable natural gas in buses is somewhat forward thinking, but it's not that unusual. I think where we've set ourselves apart maybe a little bit is we're using the same natural gas supply to help heat the terminal. And in fact, we're the first airport in North America to do that. And so with that landfill gas supply, we're feeding half of our boilers for providing both heat in the wintertime and then hot water for all sanitary restroom purposes, as well as dining and retail. And so again, that's going to push us through the next 10 years. And these two combined have really been the way that we're able to achieve that 2030 greenhouse gas reduction nearly a decade early. So that's kind of the power supply and where we're getting our natural gas. Let me shift gears a little bit and talk about what we're also doing on some of the transportation pieces. So let me first start with vehicles on the ground. And I'll make two distinctions here. It's both, this is really what we at the port are doing to support both the airlines and the passengers. So up to now, I've really been talking about reducing our port emissions through central plants and through our power supply contracts. Here, we're taking a lot of initiative to help our airlines and even our passengers reduce their own emissions. And by reference, these are what we consider our scope 3 emissions at the port. So the first one is what we call ground support equipment. And that's an image in the upper left. And, that's a lot of the tugs. In this case, it's a tow vehicle that takes the baggage carts from the aircraft down to the baggage claim area. So in this case, a lot of the airlines wanted to electrify that fleet. So beginning in 2014, we started deploying a series of electric vehicle chargers around the airport. So in this case, this individual is backing that electric vehicle into our charging station. So for the port, what we've done is we're actually funding the chargers. So we own and operate those chargers. We put them out there at our cost, and that helps the airlines make the investment in the vehicles and not have to make the additional investment in the charging system. So that's one way that we're able to enable some sustainability initiatives on behalf of the airlines, and that we're taking some of the burden off from a financial standpoint. They do pay for the power, but also we try and incentivize them. We don't charge any demand charges for when they're using it for vehicle charging. So that's one area. That program has been very successful. Right now we have about 250 units, which covers half of the airport. We're beginning construction on the second phase, which when done in about 2 years, will have vehicle chargers throughout the airport for all ground support equipment. And I think there's about 550 that will be deployed. The second area that we support the airlines probably isn't as familiar. When you're on an aircraft and you land at SeaTac and you come up to the boarding gate, you're worried about getting your luggage off and moving on to your next destination. But below the aircraft, we do a couple things. First, we plug an electrical cord into the aircraft. And by doing that, that powers the electronics they have on board. And therefore, they don't have to run their engines or their auxiliary power unit on the aircraft to maintain their electrical supply on the aircraft. And then what you see in that second image is a large yellow tube that's about 12 inches in diameter. And that worker is about to plug that into the bottom of the airplane, which is above his head. And when he goes back, he pushes a button, and heated and or cooled air goes through that duct system from our facility. And that's what's distributed throughout the aircraft. So while it's at our passenger loading bridge, it's maintaining the comfortable temperature that you see when you're both deplaning and when we're adding new passengers on for the next flight. So it's a tremendous savings, both in cost and emissions for the airlines. And it's something that we've enabled that to happen through some investments on our side. We have a dedicated plant that provides the chilled water for that. So that's what we're doing for the airlines. For some of our passengers, we have a very large parking garage that is next to our terminal. We handle about 10,000, we have over 10,000 parking stalls in that unit. And we continue to roll out more and more chargers. So if you are local and you're going on a trip and you drive an electric vehicle, you can come to our garage, you can reserve a slot that has an EV charger. And when you get back from your trip, whether it's a day or a week, you will have a fully charged vehicle to head on to your next destination. So we've got 75 units deployed right now, with an additional number for many of our employees like myself. And we're doubling that number next year. So we'll have at least 150 EV chargers. And it's at no charge other than what the parking rates are. So there we're trying to enable our passengers who drive electric vehicles to be able to recharge while they're at the airport on a trip. One of the other areas that we're working very hard on are the rideshare drivers. So again, these are like the Ubers who do a lot of work here at the airport, shuttling passengers in and out. In order to gain access to the airport, we are requiring all of those drivers and those vehicles to be low emissions, so either all electric or hybrid. But of course, they need a place to recharge as well. Several years ago, we did deploy 4 fast chargers. So those are the 480 volt variety in our cell phone lot. And some of the Uber drivers could recharge at that point pretty quickly. But that's also for use for the general public. So we're deploying 10 additional fast chargers in a dedicated lot near the airport just for the ride shift drivers, so that they can pretty quickly refuel their vehicles before coming into the airport to take passengers. So a lot of effort just to work on this mostly ground transportation piece. I noted before we have our own fleet of 750 vehicles that we are working to convert over to all electric, and we will deploying chargers for them as well. So that's a lot of our effort on that arena. Just check the time here. So things are going along just fine. Next, I want to talk about the central mechanical plant. So our terminal is served by one centralized mechanical plant that provides all of the heating, not only for the spaces, but for all of the hot water needs. And then we also do have quite a bit of cooling, particularly in the summertime, but actually throughout the year, we have some cooling needs. And our central mechanical plant is a little bit dated. So this is a picture of a couple of the boilers. They're old, but they're well maintained, still fairly efficient. But we are looking very hard at what the future looks like for this facility. And we've done really 2 studies underway, a very lengthy one that's been in plans for about 2 years and just got the report at the end of last year that lays out several different options and that I'll talk about. But it's such a big decision for the airport and a pretty expensive one as well as to which direction. I think, Tom, you mentioned you've got an upcoming speaker from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab. We've also contracted with them. They're doing an independent study for us. We just thought it'd be good to have a second opinion on the decision-making process as we go forward looking at what to do. And really, the options that we see are really into 3 categories. One, we could continue to use the renewable natural gas. Right now, we're using about half the gas to do the heating. We could buy additional quantities of that, still operate our existing equipment or even a replacement type equipment. So that is clearly one option and probably the easiest and the lowest capital up front. But there are some challenges with that. The next one that we're looking at is we could continue to operate a steam system throughout the airport, but instead of natural gas or renewable natural gas fired boilers, it would be converted to steam. I'm sorry, converted to electric boilers. And then the third category is abandoning the steam portion and really moving to a hot water distribution system. And this is where we can introduce some maybe more mature technology around heat pumps that really can't produce the steam, but they can produce hot water sufficient enough to meet some of our needs. One of the challenges there, though, is that our whole distribution system is built on steam. And so the pipes are not large enough to be able to convey the same amount of heat that steam does with hot water. So we'd have a lot more changes to our distribution pipes and to our air handlers and all of the heat exchangers throughout the plant. So big decisions coming up. Obviously, some of the criteria we're looking at is what we're looking at total cost of ownership. And it's not just the raw cost. We're also factoring in the price of carbon. Even though there's not a price in it today, we are factoring that into our decision making. We have some real space limitations. You know, others have made this conversion maybe from steam to hot water, but they had the ability maybe to build a separate plant next to the airport and then make a cutover. We don't really have that option. We just don't have the space. So, and in this picture here, the electric boilers and some of the other electric options, the equipment's much larger. And the roof that you see there, or the ceiling, is actually not a traditional ceiling. There's actually vehicles driving on top of that. So in order for us to fit that equipment into the existing space, we actually have to dig foundations and go down rather than going up. And always, we have to maintain operations 24/7. And we are looking at some of the emerging mandates. You may be seeing things in the news about certain areas of the country looking to ban the use of natural gas for heating. That's certainly something that's we're hearing here on the West Coast, so we're watching that as well and factoring that into our decision making. So I've talked a lot about the airport. Let me jump and talk a little bit about what we're doing on the waterfront. Again, if you remember the chart, their greenhouse gas emissions are not nearly as much. They don't use much in the way of natural gas. But there's still lots of opportunities. And the one I'll focus on is what I'm calling waterfront electrification. Again, goal to be zero carbon by 2040. And really the approach is to do some what we're calling shore power. So the picture on the top that you see, that's one of our cruise ship berths. So we have 2 cruise ships in, particularly during the summertime. And when they're berthed at this dock, they are able to turn off all of their engines and not burn any fossil fuels. And instead, they're being supplied electrical power from the local utility, which is also nearly carbon free. So that's done a lot. And we continue to look at that opportunity to provide shore power. Sort of the map you see in the center on the right. So that cruise terminal has the yellow piece that shows current hydropower. That's that cruise terminal. We have several in construction. I'm having a look. The orange color, those facilities that you see at the bottom of that map, those are generally the cargo facilities that have the large cranes that offload the shipping containers. So we've got that orange one. That new facility goes online in 2023, and it will have shore power for those cargo vessels. And then we're working on some plans. In fact, just awarded a contract for an underwater sea cable to be able to provide some power, I believe, to the Terminal 46 facility there. So we do have plans to electrify that waterfront such that the cruise ships and the cargo ships, when they're docked at our port facilities and in the Seattle harbor, won't be using any fossil fuels while they're at dock. And then the last one, which is fairly new, and I don't really have any images, but we just signed a contract with Seattle City Light, which is an electrical provider, to look at producing hydrogen in and around the downtown area. And while that might be used to do some of the electrification, that also might be a fuel for the vessels themselves in the future. Probably not going to have batteries large enough to send a cruise ship or a cargo ship out into the sea, but hydrogen looks a little more promising. And particularly with our green electrical grid here, we could produce hydrogen that's fairly green, and that could be used to fuel the ships. So that study is just getting underway. Don't have any results, but it's really looking at what we're doing on the future, particularly on the maritime side. And the aircraft side, not to be outdone in terms of fueling the aircraft that actually fly. So sustainable aviation fuel is been around for some time. It's still not the standard, but it is certainly out there and in some cases available, but needs a lot more work to be more common. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's really aviation fuel that's what we call drop-in. It looks chemically very similar, if not identical, to traditional aviation fuel, and it comes from things such as forest residuals, agricultural wastes, even solid waste, municipal solid waste, or the traditional sort of fats and oils that are produced. So the Port of Seattle and our airport in particular were the first to set a target that by 2028, we want to see 10% of the fuel available at SeaTac produced both locally and from sustainable sources. While we have a facility here in the state that produces this type of fuel, it's actually being shipped out of state because there are more incentives in some of the other Western states. So we're doing some work there. And really our focus here is we are not the providers of the fuel, whether it's sustainable fuel or the traditional fuel. Others do that. We do have the infrastructure. So we are building out our piping infrastructure to be able to handle both the additional supplies that we need, but also to be able to blend in the sustainable aviation fuel when it becomes more readily available. We're doing that through a variety of partnerships with the airlines who are eager to adopt more of this, particularly as it gets a little more cost effective. Manufacturers such as the Boeing company that produce most of the aircraft to make sure that it's going to work on those aircrafts. And then we've done some work with local universities. The image that I have is a report that was done in 2019 with Washington State University about the potential feedstock supplies here in the Pacific Northwest. And then the last piece that we do in addition to the infrastructure and the partnerships is advocacy, both at the state and federal level. Our commissioners are very adamant that we continue to push sustainable aviation fuel because you know, once they're in the air, there's a lot of jet fuel used. And so whatever we can do as a port entity while they're fueling here, we want to try and enable the best that we can for those airline partners. Got just a couple more slides and then be open for questions. Kind of the next phase is what we call urban air mobility. So this is not just the sustainable aviation fuel that we talked about, but really the electrification of that. And so there are things such as air taxis. You see the image in the upper right. I chose this photo. This is from a company called Wisk, W-I-S-K. And what's notable about them is I noticed in the news yesterday, they got a $450 million investment from the Boeing company. So they have prototypes. They're out flying right now. They're vertical takeoff and landing, so they can land like a helicopter and then cruise up to about 100 miles an hour. They are autonomous in general. And so while they're still in development, a lot of them, and there are many different manufacturers are targeting, hopefully by 2028, they'll start be able to being used. And you might think about that as a taxi. Rather than taking a taxi to the airport, you might be able to take an air taxi and land on some sort of portal that we're all looking at. In fact, I have an image there in the center. That's actually in the United Kingdom, so that's not here in Seattle, but it's a prototype that they're looking that's where people would come. They would jump on an autonomous air taxi that would take them to another destination. So something that we're certainly looking at. There's some work done at the state level to get ready for this. And eventually they're going to come to me as utility manager and say, I need to be able to refuel my vehicle at your airport. So that's the air taxi. The other one is the electric airplane. I don't know if and when we're going to see 737 or 747 sized aircraft doing electrical, but certainly there are smaller options. That image in the lower left is from British Columbia. That's actually a converted Beaver aircraft. That is an all-electric vehicle aircraft that is in operation today for short hauls in and around the Vancouver area. And then lastly, a lot of this is in the airspace for the FAA. They're not waiting. They're working on concepts of operations for these sorts of vehicles and anything new that may come along. I'm just going to wrap it up here with just some of the additional things we're doing at the Port of Seattle. Yes, it does rain here at least 9 months out of the year. So one of our newer facilities that we did a large renovation because we had an opportunity to put in new roofs and new plumbing at that facility. We installed our rainwater capture system, and we have storage tanks where we capture the rainwater. We treat it so that it's sanitary, and then it's plumbed directly just to restrooms for flushing, not for hand washing, but for flushing. Still evaluating that, but we're looking to expand that if it's successful. As you'd expect, we're doing a fair amount of recycling. We do a fair amount of composting here. You can see the image there in the center in our central terminal, how we segregate the wastes and the recyclables and the compost. Done a lot of energy conservation over the years. I won't talk much more about that. And then the newest thing is what we call the sustainability framework. And it's really at the direction of our elected officials. They wanted to weigh in earlier in the design phase on some of the sustainability aspects. So we put this policy directive out just last year. That image is the front page of that, but it really drives early decisions on things such as solar roofs. And so you can see the left-hand photo, that's one of our marinas, and that building that's under construction with the solar panels, that's the central restroom facility. And without that sustainability framework, the things like solar in Seattle might have been ruled out or thought to be not as cost effective, but our commission wants us to be much more aggressive on that. So that really drives a lot of decision making down very early in the design phase, and we make some of those decisions early on. So I've talked a lot. I hope you have some questions for what time we have left. And so I'm going to open it back up.
Thank you very, very much, Keith. Really, really insightful. And I wish our airports on the East Coast were doing something to be anywhere close to what is happening in the Seattle area. It's really exciting.
Thank you.
There are a number of questions. So I will ask the first one, and then Joe, you can chime in with the next one.
Sure.
So do morning jet trails, oh, hold on a minute. Just a second, okay. So the first question is actually related to the central plant and all your different options and going to water. Have you considered using geothermal in any way in this new plant design?
We have. We studied that about 5 years ago. And we just don't have the real estate. This is an image of the airport. A little closer up, the terminal is sort of at the far end there. The buildings you see on the left are a lot of the cargo operations. We just don't have the ground space really to support the amount of heat that we need. So we are looking at other condensing boilers and other air side heat pumps. But at this point, we'll look at it once more, but it was initially ruled out a couple years ago. So we just didn't have the space to be able to do that.
Okay. Joe, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. Are there concerns that the persistent drought in the Northwest can significantly affect the hydropower contributions to your green power portfolio, or is reliability of that resource not a concern at this point?
Really answers to both, yes. So from a reliability standpoint, it's probably less about the water use and more about some of the coal plants that are being retired. So the planners in the Northwest have a reliability index, and actually by 2023, we reached the threshold where we have a greater than 5% chance of a large-scale blackout or a localized blackout, and that's our threshold. So we do need to bring more resources, wind and solar on, so that's in the work. In terms of the hydro situation, it does vary from year to year. Really depends on the snowpack that you can see there on Mount Rainier. In terms of planning the resource, we really plan what we call around critical water, which was the lowest water use or lowest water available in the last, I believe, 50 years. So the planners do plan for some bad years, but longer term, with global warming, we'll lose more and more snowpack, more and more glaciers. So we still might get the amount of precipitation, but it hits the mountains and comes down all in the springtime. And it's really in the late summer when we need that snowpack to start melting and feeding our rivers. So concern on both.
Okay. Have you received any pushback from the legacy natural gas and diesel suppliers as you switch to more renewable liquid fuels?
No, some of the natural gas suppliers are trying to play in this, provide renewable natural gas as well. So in general, we have not.
Okay. What type of piping infrastructure are you building out for the SAF? And will the SAF be trucked to the airport?
Yeah, I don't have a good picture. Our fueling facility, we have several million-gallon tanks at the far end of that airport. In fact, I'm looking close. I can't even see them here. So we are adding additional capacity. Right now, all of our jet fuel comes from refineries up in the northwestern corner of the state. And so that comes through pipelines. Depending on where a future aviation fuel plant might be located, it would either be piped or trucked. And so as we're designing changes to that fueling facility, it would accommodate both offloading by truck and offloading through a pipe system if they're nearby enough, or through the existing piping system. Most of the aircraft, we have a distribution system into each gate. So for the most part, we're not refueling via tanker trucks to the aircraft. We have a distribution system that would be able to take that same aviation fuel blended with the traditional fuel.
So the next question is, do morning jet trails feathering out later negatively affect the efficiency of the solar array? And then this person is saying, thanks, Keith, so much for doing this presentation.
I'm not sure I'm following the question.
John, do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah.
You have to unmute yourself. Can't hear you, John. Can anybody hear him?
I can't. I can talk
Uh,
a little bit about.
I think, Keith, I think the question is, did the jet trails block enough sunlight to act like cloud cover? So reducing solar efficiency.
Nothing I've really thought about. We don't currently have any solar panels at the airport, but one of our new buildings was just approved through that sustainability framework. I would say it's cloudy enough on many days in Seattle where whatever impact from the jet trails isn't going to have a material difference on the solar gain at the airport.
So the follow-up to that is the solar economically viable in the Northwest?
Depends on who you talk to. It's a challenge. If you just look at the efficiency factor for Seattle in general, it's only about 11%. If I were to put that same panel over by Grand Coulee Dam, which is 150 miles away, where always clear skies and a lot more sunlight, we automatically double the amount of power coming from the same panel. So we are a little bit of a detriment here, but we really need to think about more distributed generation as well. And so we're going to try it. We've got 3 or 4 on the maritime facilities, fairly small. Everything is pretty small. We've done a pretty detailed study at the airport, looked at 12 different locations. Nothing has a payback of probably less than 100 years, but sometimes you got to just try things.
Until you put a price on carbon.
Yes, and actually in the central plant study that I talked about, we're incorporating a price of carbon there as well. So that helps make some of those decisions. Now, we're not looking at solar for central heating at this point.
Right. How about offshore wind?
Actually, yes. In fact, one of our commissioners, who's the president of our commission right now, is very big on offshore wind. We think it can be maybe both a power provider for the Northwest, but it's another area where there may be a lot of jobs at stake to build those and to install them. And we're all about economic development at the Port of Seattle. So a lot of interest. We don't really have offshore wind here today. We're still relying a lot on hydropower, but it's certainly a technology that's being looked at, as well as we've done some wave technology as well.
Next question. Have there been any issues with the use of renewable natural gas or renewable diesel?
Renewable natural gas, no. It's pretty much identical. To be able to move it to a pipeline, into a natural gas pipeline, you have to clean it up. And that's what the landfills do. Renewable diesel, I've never heard of any, at least in my 2-year tenure at the Port of Seattle. I know when some of the diesels first came out, if they sat in tanks for a long period of time, they maybe degraded a little bit. I don't know if they've solved that. But for vehicles that it's used routinely, it's not a problem. We may not use it in some of our vehicles like snow plows or fire crash trucks that maybe don't burn through a lot of fuel on a weekly or monthly basis. Good question. No, I haven't stayed up to date on the renewable diesel.
So there's a follow-up question on renewable natural gas and SAF. Do you have long-term offtake contracts with producers for these products?
For renewable natural gas, we have a 10-year contract, so that goes through 2030. And we'll make a decision at that point, particularly our bus fleet. By then, we're thinking electrification is probably more viable. So we may convert our buses over to electric. A lot of people are already doing that. Still would need it to run our central plant if we stick with that. And then on the sustainable aviation fuel, we're really not the party that's purchasing it. There are others that make it, others that distribute it here at the airport to the airlines directly. Our role at the Port of Seattle is to make sure that the infrastructure is here. But through that advocacy and partnership, we're really helping push that along to the point where there is a facility built locally that can produce that fuel for aviation purposes only. That was part of that mission, to have something that's local, that supports aviation, whether the feedstock is municipal solid waste, which we're looking at, or forest byproducts.
And
Well, I
looking
guess-
forward, what would you say is your biggest challenge looking forward?
Well, I wear a couple hats. So my day job is a utilities manager, so I'm all about reliability. So and it's not just on the power side, it's natural gas, and we have a water distribution system. So a lot about resiliency with my hat on for that role. So I don't want to see any power outages. So that's an area that we've made some pretty good progress. We have some more infrastructure to happen there. And then when I put the other hat on around sustainability, it's making some of these hard decisions, particularly things around the central plant, and what's the right blend of operational expenses versus capital, and what's the sort of the technology. That's why we're spending a lot of time doing some of these studies to really understand and help us make those really tough decisions.
Great. Is the shuttle train that runs from the airport to downtown Seattle electric? And if not, are there plans to convert it?
It is electric. So it's called light rail. And so it now goes to north of Seattle and is extending south. So it's going to be about terminals in the next 3 years, about 15 miles south of the airport. So it runs, you can't see it on here, but we kind of, so you can take that train from downtown Seattle, get off the train at the airport, and basically you're in the parking garage. You walk along a path along the parking garage and you walk right into the ticketing counter. So more and more people are using that, and it is all electric.
Okay, Joe?
How did your electrical operations fare during the heat bubble last summer?
Wow. In Seattle, 90-degree temperatures don't happen very much, but they happen every summer. I'm a lifelong Northwesterner. I think I saw one 100-degree day once about 10 years ago. And I was the facilities manager, and we maxed out our cooling capacity at the facility. We had to turn lights off to help keep the facility cool. But there were 3 days in, believe it or not, June, where at SeaTac we reached 107 degrees. We were over 100 degrees for 3 straight days. Our airport weathered it fine, as did our maritime operations from a power perspective. We just had enough capacity in our substations and our distribution system that we did set records for that day. We used about 24 megawatts of power, which is a couple megawatts more than a hot summer day. The region itself did generally okay. There were some spotty outages here in the west side. The Spokane area, so on the east side of the state, they were up over 110 degrees. They did have to institute some rolling blackouts for some of their service territory. but they got through that reasonably okay. That was really a first for the Northwest. And then you add in some of the wildfires in California that interrupted some of the transmission that goes from north to south and south to north. So we fared it fine. And it's certainly helping our planning in the future, but it was 3 very unusual days.
Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I'll ask one. The hydrogen initiative on the port, people are talking about using hydrogen or liquid ammonia to power ships.
Okay.
The Maersk has announced that they're going to have the first of their 750 ships converted to hydrogen, actually using ammonia by
Oh, really?
2023. And they're going to follow with in converting basically their whole fleet by, I think, 2040 or something like that. So my question is there opportunity using hydropower and the electricity, renewable electricity, to build a hydrogen infrastructure to provide services of fueling for those ships?
Yes, and that study is underway. It was just initiated late last year. It's a partnership between both the Port of Seattle that helps serve those sorts of ships, and then with Seattle City Light. So that's the local power authority. They are nearly 100% hydro. And the port and the city of Seattle have signed an agreement, and there's a study underway. I can send you a link to the page that talks about that and what they're trying to do, but it's exactly that. It's that sort of what I'll call the fueling piece for the large cargo ships, rather than, we have a solution for them while they're berthed here at the Port of Seattle. We've electrified them so they don't have to burn, but sort of the minute they leave the port, they're looking at options. And I had heard that Maersk, and I think he sent me a link to that was moving towards hydrogen. And that's the study that's just beginning here in Seattle to maybe look at using particularly off-peak renewable power, hydropower and other renewables during off-peak to generate hydrogen, store it, and then use it for transportation needs, whether it's the cargo ships or maybe some heavy-duty vehicles. Some of the very large cargo movers just are too big for maybe batteries, but they might be able to use hydrogen.
And one of our audience members is asking, will that study be public?
I'm sure it is. One thing I've learned about working for a government agency versus Boeing is we're very transparent. So if you go to the Port of Seattle website, and if you were to put in, type in probably just electrification or hydrogen, you would see the announcement that came out late last year about the partnership. There's some videos that they produced to talk about what the goal of that study is. I wish I was more familiar. I would talk more about it, but I think you're best served if you can go to our website there, or Seattle City Light as well.
Thank you. We have a congratulations comment from one of, I'm just going to read it verbatim. Congratulations on your efforts. Very inspiring overview story. With so many efforts ongoing, buy-in on these projects must have started many years ago. Yes, with folks that were enabling, passionate and engaged. I have to move it up. In your mission, what's the secret? What's the secret in getting this engagement and success?
Well, I don't think it's maybe that unusual for the Pacific Northwest. We're surrounded by some natural beauty. So, whether it's the Port of Seattle or my previous employer, Boeing, or some of the other large, look at Amazon that's based here, and or REI, and even Starbucks, a lot of forward thinkers in terms of sustainability. So, but I would have to also credit, it's our elected commissioners that, they have to take the heat for some of this spending, but they're very passionate about this and about climate change in general. And so they're, in some cases, the ones pushing us along. to do more and more and more. So, and they've made the investments over the years, and the partnership, particularly at the airport, with the airlines who are wanting solutions as well. And then you mentioned Maersk on the maritime side. The entities that we're serving are also demanding this, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel, or they want to be able to purchase electric vehicles, electric ground support equipment. And for us to be able to put the infrastructure in to be able to enable that to work is a great piece of the partnership.
Well, Keith, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your passion with the Maria audience. I'm getting a lot of thank yous here. Great presentation. Thank you so much for informative program. We really
Thank you all.
appreciated you being involved and joining us for this monthly meeting.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and please come out, visit us, and take a cruise, go see a hydroelectric dam. They have visitor hours all the time. So really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invite, Keith. I love it out there.
Right. Well, hope to see you soon.
Okay.
Particularly in the summertime.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Keith. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
so
I know
much.
you're busy. We really appreciate your time.
All right.
And
Thank you all.
thanks
Have a good
everybody for
evening.
joining. And remember, next month, February 22nd, another presentation, Bartlett Tree Experts. See you then.
Have a good night.